Join the coven. Today's video is brought to you by Audible. Audible is offering my listeners a free audiobook with a 30-day trial membership. Just go to audibletrial.com/GothicRose and browse the unmatched selection of audio programs. Download a title for free and start listening. It's that easy. Just go to audibletrial.com/GothicRose to get started today. The Women in the Wall. A story written by EmilyWillowWrites. Every night, I can hear the women in the walls crying. It's an old building, a relic of the Victorian working class. The squat structure of dilapidated brick holds a series dingy one-room flats. It's a roof over my head, but hardly worthy of being called a home. The first night I heard it, I thought it was the neighbors. It was a soft, barely audible sob. I tried brushing it off, rolling over in bed to face away from the offending wall. But it persisted, growing a bit louder with each sob until I began to feel bad for the poor girl on the other side of the wall. With a high-pitched feminine voice, I assumed she must be young. She did not stop until the early light of sunrise seeped through my window. The next night was worse. By dusk, I had already flung myself onto my stained mattress, exhausted from the previous night of no sleep. But just as my heavy eyelids began to close, I heard the dreaded crying once more. I tossed and turned in a frustration. Then I noticed something odd. The voice was different than it had been the previous night. It was a deeper, more raspy sob, yet still distinctly that of a female. The deep exhale with each breath gave a sense of exasperation. I don't know how long I laid there listening before hearing a weak, shaky scream. I shot out of bed, my heart beating quickly. Part of me thought about banging on the wall, attempting to remind this lady that there were other people trying to enjoy some peace and quiet. But I could not bring myself to do so. A pang of unease went through my chest. This woman was clearly in deep emotional pain, and it was beginning to disturb me. "You need to check on my neighbor, flat 32A? The landlord peeked up at me with a furrowed brow, setting down the newspaper he had been reading. "And why exactly do I need to do that?" "She's cried all night for 2 nights in a row now. I'm going on 48 hours of no sleep." The landlord let out a deep sigh before picking up the mug of burnt tea from his desk and leaning further back into his old squeaky chair. "Have you tried banging on the wall?" I involuntarily rolled my eyes. The closet-sized room that could barely pass as a leasing office stunk of sweat and cigarettes. I was anxious to get out of there. I'm not about to bang on the wall when this poor woman is obviously already distraught. "Well, I'll go check out the situation today, but I'm sorry to tell you that it's likely squatters. Nobody is renting 32A. My stomach dropped. It was not the idea of the homeless using the flat beside mine that bothered me. In a place as rundown as this, a few people looking for shelter was bound to happen every now and then. Rather, the feeling was something I couldn't put my finger on. A deep unrest quite unlike anything I had ever felt before. The landlord must have noticed the look of fear on my face. Don't worry, miss. If we get squatters, I'll call the police and you'll be free of the disturbance by tonight." "Thank you," was all I could get out before turning and walking away. I stayed out late that night despite my exhaustion. Returning to my flat was not something I was eager to do, even if the landlord had already rid the building of unwanted dwellers. I sat at the corner pub until near 2 a.m., ordering more rounds of whiskey than I should have, and losing myself in the patterns of the old Oakwood bar. "You okay, hun?" The bartender caught me off guard as she took the shot glass from in front of me and poured another without needing to ask. Yeah, I'm fine, thanks," I mumbled. She set the refilled glass back in its place and gave me a warm smile. "I'll be here all night if you change your mind." I nodded, appreciative of the concern, but I could not bring myself to talk. The bartender smiled once more before turning her attention to another customer and leaving me to my drunken stupor. I don't remember returning home nor falling asleep, but I must have, because I woke up in bed, still during the dark hours of night, to feel my heart sink once more. The cries of the previous nights had now become full-blown wailing, a shrieking, hysterical noise that sent a stabbing pain through my head. And I swear it was a new voice. The tone was entirely different. It was more desperate, more panic-inducing. It was then followed by the undeniable whine of an infant. Both voices in unison were too much to bear. Jumping out of bed and snatching my robe from the chair, I hurriedly made my way to flat 32A. As I stood at their door, I realized that I can no longer hear anything. The long, poorly lit hallway was completely silent. This was something I could not make any sense of. Every flat was the same, a cramped room with paper-thin walls and a flimsy wood door. There was no way that I would not have been able to hear the woman just as clearly from the hall as I could from my own flat. I stood perfectly still, listening for even the quietest of sound. Minutes passed by with still nothing. Nearly without thinking, I began to pound at the door, rattling its old frame, but I was met with no response. After several more minutes, I spoke. "Are you okay in there? I heard you and your baby crying. Everything all right?" Again, I was met with silence. Sick with the pounding headache and churning stomach of a hangover, and at a loss for what else to do, I stumbled back into my flat. Barely a moment passed before the shrieks and weeping started back up. But at this point, my mind was to the breaking point. I dug through my purse to find my phone, and I dialed 999 with shaking hands. "What's your emergency?" "There's a woman next door, and something is wrong." I cut the respondent off, panic clear in my voice. "She's crying. She's been crying for days. Her baby is crying. I can hear her through the walls." The police arrived surprisingly quick. "Come in, listen to her voice," I said more frantically than I had intended. Two tall, bulky men followed me through the door, pausing for a moment before giving me a look of both pity and annoyance. "Ma'am, there's no crying." I stared at them in disbelief as the voice of the woman pounded through my ears. What do you mean? It's right here." I put both hands to the wall, slapping my palms against it, trying to convey the source of the horrid cacophony of mother and child. Both officers looked at each other and frowned. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to calm down, all right?" No, I stuttered. "Why can't you hear it?" One of the officers bent slightly down, lowering his face to my level. "Do you need us to take you to the hospital?" he said in a deliberately calm and even tone. I don't understand." "I'm calling the landlord," said the second officer, taking his phone from his pocket and stepping out into the hallway. "Sorry to disturb you, sir." but we've got an issue with one of the tenants at your building." His voice trailed off behind the ever-constant cries. "We just need you to hold tight, ma'am. Your landlord is on his way." This brought a shred of hope to me. The landlord would have to be able to hear it. I didn't know why the police were lying to me about the sound. The landlord angrily shook his head as he shuffled through his large ring of keys, trying to find the one to flat 32A. Now standing in the hall beside the officers, the wails had once again faded to silence. At this point, I no longer tried to make sense of it. I was simply relieved to have a moment of peace. He shoved the proper key into the deadbolt and flung the door open. "See, I told you there was no one here. I checked the place this afternoon, right after you left my office." The light of the hallway spilled into an empty room. The worn wooden floor was clean. The yellowed walls were bare. There was nobody. There was nothing. "No renters, no squatters," the landlord continued. "Not even so much as a food wrapper, or a blanket, or any evidence at all that anyone has been here." "Sir," the officer gave him a stern, knowing look, trying to convey that the situation should remain subdued. It was clear that all three men thought I was utterly insane. The landlord waved his hand in dismissal. "Can I go home now?" "Yes, go," the officer said with slight frustration. He turned back to me. "We're going to have to check your flat for any illegal substances." "Can I wait in the hall?" I asked. I didn't even care if they thought I was on drugs. I just needed to stay out of that god-awful room, away from the screams. An hour later, the police emerged from my flat, looking down at me as I sat on the dirty hallway carpet. "Everything's clear," one of them announced. "Now, are you going to be able to stay calm and get some rest here, or do we need to get you to a hospital?" I shook my head and forced a weak smile. "I'll be fine." They helped me up and gently held me by the arm as they walked me back through the door. The return of the weeping was almost immediate. I kept myself from wincing. I did not want to be taken away to a mental ward. "Are you sure you're going to be all right, ma'am?" the cop repeated. I nodded. "Yes, I'm sorry. I get confused sometimes." I shakily formed the words while forcing another smile. They left me standing there alone. But I was not alone. The women were there with me. "Stop!" I yelled. "Just please, I beg you. Stop weeping. I can help you. I can help you." My voice trailed off into a whimper. "You cannot undo that which has already been done." A choir of female voices answered me. "My baby was taken by consumption," one voice said. "My husband beat me every night," another voice spoke up. "There was not enough bread for everyone, so I fed the children first," a third voice chimed in. Slowly, more and more words and tones became louder, one layering over the next until I could no longer differentiate between them. It grew into a symphony of sorrow, a collection of history's darkness. "My son never came home from the workhouse. Countless men came each night to lie with me in exchange for the pennies they threw at my feet. I can still remember the crack of his fist against my head. The shopkeeper I worked for ruined me, yet I was the one branded promiscuous. I was 2 pennies short for bread. My infant screamed with hunger. I held my tongue to keep him from hitting me. It never worked. I tried to stifle my cries each night so the children wouldn't hear. No gentleman would ever think of marriage to a harlot. There was no one to take me away from this hell. They promised me more money than they had, and only paid after using me. The fumes from the factory filled my heavy lungs. My daughter was too frail to walk. I couldn't bear to look at my bruises in the mirror. I hid the blood that rose from my lungs with each cough. I didn't want my boy to be frightened. He drank away all of our money. I scoured the streets for scraps of food. I let him have his way with me in the alley. I didn't have enough coin to rent a bed for the night. There was no one to help me. There was no one to save me. There was no one to help my family. And all I had was this room. I could barely afford this room. This goddamn room with all its horrors. Only the walls have seen our suffering, trapped inside this hellscape of brick and mortar. The walls have stared at our pain with cold, dead eyes. Our lives are lost to time. No one knows. No one remembers. No one can hear us. Only the walls. The walls. I can hear you, I yelled into the paint and plaster. I will stay. I will listen. I will remember. Suddenly the cacophony of cries began to subside. A quiet calm came over me, a feeling I had not experienced in what felt like an eternity. I waited, unmoving, my hand pressed to the wall. Moments passed, and still no sound came. It must have been mere seconds of the newfound silence before my body gave in to utter exhaustion, and I collapsed to the floor. For the first time in days, I slept. It was a deep, dreamless rest. And I awoke the next morning still laying on the floor. Light spilled in through the window. The birds sang softly. I took a deep breath. I could sleep again. And so, every night, the women come to talk to me, to cry upon my shoulder, to vent their sorrows to my open ears, to release the pain that they could not in life. But now their cries stop after a while to let me rest. I listen, I weep with them, I console them, I will keep my promise. So I stay in this dingy building of dilapidated brick. I stay for them. I stay so the horrors of history will not be forgotten. I fear what will happen to the women when I'm dead and gone. I fear no one will hear them again. Yet, what scares me the most is that, perhaps, I will become just another woman in the wall.